a time to just remember, I mentioned yesterday that there was a complexity conference in 1972 at the AA, which was subsequently published. And I think it was worthwhile to note what the intellectual and cultural context of that conference was and what happened to it. In the mid-'60s and late '60s, there was a real interest generated by cybernetics and systems theory to look at the possibility of deterministic modeling of complex systems, and it culminated in that conference. And then a series of social upheavals in the United States and in Europe, Woodstock, Altamont, the May events in Paris, the assassination of the civil rights leaders, the invasion of Czechoslovakia, caused a change in direction. The change in direction in architecture meant less interest, less faith in the possibility of scientific modeling, and more attention to the cultural and, for lack of a better word, the philosophical foundations. And so work at the AA and other places turned to questions of philosophy, to the psychopolitics of the event, to the impossibility of scientific models of meaning, to deconstructing institutions that associated with that, and essentially a very optimistic and ambitious work in a collaboration between science and architecture came to an end, and a very important period, which we call postmodernism, began, which the AA, among other schools, was a key contributor to. I think that one of the things we're trying to do at this conference is see if there's any renewal of a dialogue from both of those camps that without forgetting the gains of either. I think a key figure in that history is Peter Eisenman, both from a philosophical and certainly from an architectural point of view, but from a philosophical point of view. So I'm pleased to introduce Peter to begin our discussion of architecture. Oh, I have to read something, sorry. Oh yes, if you can't see in here, you can, it's very 60s today, so you can sit down in the front, or there's a video presentation simultaneously in the back members room upstairs in the bar, and the communication studio, which is impossible to find. Also, the bar upstairs is open and the Triangle Bookshop is open during the break. So let me introduce Peter Eisenman. Thank you.
Just having briefly watched the scientists perform, I'm struck by two things. One is that this is a very unbalanced conference in that I think you could call it, there are two groups. One, the scientists, and the second group are called the science enviers. And that's a directional arrow because I don't think it works the other way. I don't think there are architects and architect enviers. And of course, I would certainly like to analyze why that is the case. The second thing is that I'm struck by each of the scientists at a certain point brought in this notion of aesthetics. And they did things because they look nice, right? And, you know, if I were to say that I did something because it looked nice, I would be hooted out of this hall. And I think we have different standards of judgment when it comes to architecture and to scientists. That scientists are untouchable in a sense because they have a certain level of knowledge that we common folk don't have. What is interesting is because all common folk are architects and therefore the architects possess no knowledge that no one does not have. The third thing that struck me was in watching all these wiggles and squiggles and things move about, which I'm fascinated with, is that there are three issues that I think come up. One is that architecture deals with the most terrible determinism, that is the question of presence, and must always do so if it is going to deal with shelter, enclosure, and all of these kinds of things. The second terrible aspect of that determinism is that it is mechanical, and will always be dealing with mechanics and statics, and therefore also must deal with form, that it begins from dealing with a condition of static form. And what is interesting, I want to give you 3 separate instances. The last one, Professor Shaw's notion of the wall, I wanted to raise the question of the wall in 3 different areas to show how laconic, as it were, or diffident, or insouciant the world is to the wall, you know, walls. Oh my gosh. I went one day, some many years ago, to see the editor of the New York Review of Books, to complain to him that there was not enough coverage of architecture, especially ideas about architecture, in particular theories of architecture. And I was questioning as to why that was the case. And this very renowned intellectual looked at me in a certain kind of displeasure, or why was I disturbing him, and he came out with the most fundamental thing. He said, Mr. Eisenman, he said, I prefer to live in houses, not talk about them. And there was very little I could say to that. The second thing is that Rosalind Krauss, a colleague of mine for many years and a very, I think, important art historian, has written a book recently called The Optical Unconscious. And in this book, there is a very important passage on Jackson Pollock, where she says that when a Pollock is placed on the floor in the position that it was painted, it is a savage work. But the minute, she says, that the canvas is taken off the floor and moved to a vertical position on the wall, it becomes naturalized, reinstitutionalized, and reinscribed into the discourse of painting. And I think, my God, what a thing, you know. And I have written a text, which I'm not going to give today, but it's called, What About the Goddamn Wall, Rosalind? She assumes that this is, oh well, what a natural phenomenon, that something could change from being savage on the floor to natural on a wall without questioning at all why this could take place. And clearly it does not take place in the canvas, but in the relationship of the canvas to the horizontal surface and the vertical surface. This goes as well, of course everybody knows that when you move a Jackson Pollock from the floor to the wall, it moves from being savage to institutionalized. And then, of course, the last, I call culprit, who blithely throws in 2 or 3 walls into these bug movements and says, look what happens. They become stabilized, but doesn't even think to say, well, why? Why do walls have this effect? And what's interesting is, in all 3 cases, it is architects who are left to pick up the pieces of this seemingly unimportant or natural condition of the wall. Well, we have walls. Of course we have walls. So what's the big deal? I prefer to live in them than to talk about them. Or I prefer to be amused about them rather than to talk about them or to worry about their consequences. And I think that this condition where an intellectual, an art historian, and a scientist all presume the naturalness of the wall to be a given is precisely where architecture begins, and also where architecture finds its unique problematic. And I believe that architecture differs from bug study, writing, art history, in the fact that its problem is unique in that there is this linking of what I call its iconicity with its instrumentality. And it is such a linking that defines both one term and the other simultaneously. I would argue that in no other discourse is the iconicity and the instrumentality so linked. And because of this linking, there is this thought to be naturalness between the wall and its conventions. Now, I argue that this leads to what I call the singularity of architecture, or to what Jacques Derrida might call the being only once of a work of art. And Derrida argues in Truth of Painting that the being only once of a work of art is the fault line of deconstruction in relation to, particularly, photography. He says that as soon as the technique of reproduction reaches the stage of photography, a break line and also a new front traverses the whole space of art. That is, the presumed uniqueness of production. He says that the being only once of an exemplar in the photograph and the value of authenticity of the original, the first, the prior condition, is practically deconstructed. Now, one can give a fantastic example of what has happened between the mechanical reproduction of a photograph, where you have a physical plate, and you have, from that physical plate, a first pulling of a photograph, a second one, and a third one, where the first one, being closer in time and in space to the original, has more value than the second, the third, etc. That was in mechanical reproduction of a photograph. Now, this break line occurs when you get to electronic reproduction. And of course, this break line, this notion of the difference between the original in mechanical reproduction and in electronic reproduction, leads you to a situation where in a digitized photograph, there is no original. There are only electronic impulses, ones and zeros. There is no longer an object. There is, therefore, no longer a being only once. Because even to the expert eye, no one can tell whether the photograph that is being produced is the first one or the second one of a series within a digitized condition. But this also has a reverse effect in digitized reproduction, in the sense that the subjective characteristics are both erased, i.e., as being only once, but the converse is also true, because the electronic reproduction, the digitized photograph, is now open to the most individual authorial mediation. For example, we used to use a photograph of an original, let's say, of a work of art to attest to whether a signature was real or not. And people would study the photographs of a Rembrandt signature rather than necessarily the signature itself. But now, through the digitizing process, we can take a photograph of a Rembrandt and digitize in the signature from another, and no expert could tell the difference. So that you can now mediate, in an authorial sense, more than you could in the past, and therefore we have this converse situation where, through mediation, we have a new condition of the being only once. And this being only once no longer deals with the original. There is no longer the original involved in the model condition, but in fact the human mediation. Now, what I would argue is that architecture does not present this kind of spectrum of mediation precisely because it does not deal with print media, where the iconographic or iconicity can be detached from the instrumentality. You can add more or less iconographic material through instrumentality, or you can erase iconographic material, so that there is no necessary one-to-one connection between instrumentality and iconicity. Now, here I want to say that I'm going to talk about built architecture and the process of making built architecture as opposed to the drawing of architecture, which also is open to the same kind of mediation. First of all, the being only once of architecture, I would like to argue, is not at issue. First, because the building of architecture is always a condition of the being only once, site-specific, program-specific, time-specific, and therefore it's never an issue. In other words, it is not a fault line on which to discuss the condition of architecture. What I want to say is that what is interesting is the possibility, which would be for me a different fault line, that is to open up and try and split apart the instrumentality and the iconicity of architecture. And this leads to a condition for me which I call presentness. Now, presentness is a condition of architecture which I would argue is unique to any object that has this linking of iconicity and iconography. It is precisely because of this thought to be naturalness, the unique conventionality of architecture, which does not exist in the photograph or the painting, that presentness comes into play. And presentness must come into play precisely as a subversive agent. In other words, it only operates to subvert this thought to be naturalness of the normative conditions of architecture at any one time. Now, what I would argue then is that presentness is a condition of insidedness in architecture that lies within its interiority. It is an already given, in an Althusserian sense of the term, that is in fact necessary for architecture to maintain itself. And it continues, I would argue, to maintain itself precisely because of this subversive impulse to produce this other condition of being only once. To achieve what I call presentness, in other words, for architecture to be, it must overcome what always has been up to that moment. That is, the normative, typological, conventional, and social gestures that exist at architecture at any one time, which one can say is the normative body of architecture. Now, I would argue that Michelangelo's Laurentian library, there is an initial subversion of type, of the existing type form of the library, and there is a subversion of the conventions of architecture, of the wall, of the notion of entry, of the notion of relationship of spaces, which is also altered in this condition. And I would say that the Laurentian library today retains the same affective charge that it had in the 16th century, precisely because it has not been reabsorbed, that those things which it subverted have not been reabsorbed into the conventions of architecture. And further, I would argue in this constellation that I'm trying to draw that the longer the subversion is in place, the more the architecture remains as canonic, and that the architecture which is canonic has always been subversive of the normative conditions of at the time, and that to be canonic means to have activated this already in place subversive mechanism called presentness. I will take again two further examples of this subversive mechanism in two of the late works of Le Corbusier of approximately the same date, Ronchamp and La Tourette. At the time of their making, at the time of their first seeing by anyone, they both contained a presentness. I would argue that the presentness that they contained has now, in the 40 intervening years, radically changed. One, that La Tourette maintains that presentness, whereas Ronchamp does not. This is because, I would argue, that Ronchamp contained the presentness of only the new. That is, what it did was theatrical and performative. It affected the body and experience of the space because of its newness, but did not displace the instrumentality of type or the conventions of instrumentality that went along with this type form. Whereas La Tourette, as a monastery, there was both the subversion of type, form, and icon, as well as the conventions of organization, the wall, the floor, the enclosure. All of these things were subverted and produced a new condition of monastery, which has not been reabsorbed into the normative typology. In other words, become reabsorbed and therefore to lose its presentness. Because the dislocation of type was so strong that it remains to this day a work of presentness. Now, I would say that what in the electronic mediated condition that we find ourselves in, where questions of mediation, authorial mediation, and object and originality and the being only once are primary issues in the subjective notion of creativity or work of art or work of architecture, that architecture has to continue to examine its being only once in order to continue not merely to subvert type, but also to subvert convention. Now, I'm going to show two projects today which deal with the attempt to subvert a series of conventions that are internal to architecture. In other words, that once we begin to look at models, let's say, of complexity from other discourses, we can also, when we have, in fact, the responsibility to see how, in fact, those models, in an analogous way, affect internal conditions of architecture. The two issues that the two buildings attempt to talk about are, one, the question of profile, and two, the question of Poche. Now again, the question of profile in architecture is assumed to be a natural condition. When we draw or think about architecture, we are always drawing an outline. We always draw something outside, and the space comes from that initial profile. When we want to model, as it were, or to draw space on a computer, we have to draw a single profile, and then we draw a second profile, and we subtract the second from the first in order to get the void, as it were. What is so interesting is, and I met with the people from Silicon Graphics last week and had a 2 or 3 hour discussion with them, even in advanced systems such as Silicon Graphics and their Alias program, there is no system for modeling voids. That is, for modeling things which do not have a profile. All of their advanced systems model profiles. Now, why it's very interesting today to think about conditions without profile and to change profile is that clearly the modeling of profile is one of the fundamental tenets of the latent and ever-present phallocentrism of Western architecture. And that to continue to model solids and profiles continues to keep in place to maintain the phallocentrism that underlies most of Western architecture. And it would be interesting, and propose this to the Silicon Graphics people, that we would love to be involved in a research program that tried to find software that modeled voids, that is, modeled conditions of what one might call, to begin with, the formless rather than the formed. And clearly, another aspect of Rosalind Krauss's book, which I think is interesting, is the beginning to talk about the subject of the inform, or the unformed, or the formless, as not the opposite of the formed, but as another analogic term that might project into the possibility of architecture. Now, the most recent study of profile that I know was put forward by Luigi Moretti in the early 1950s in his magazine called Spazio number 6, where he talked about the notion of moda natura. And this title, Valori della moda natura, dealt with the question of modeling and profiling. And he said, which is interesting, that moda natura, or profile, was the only form of figural abstraction in architecture that was being unto itself, which had been unfortunately removed by rationalist architecture from the canon of its discourse. Now, clearly, Moretti's idea of moda natura as an abstraction had nothing to do with the decorative arts that the postmodern revival of Poche and profile has brought about, but rather some other more imminent condition of architecture was being questioned. And clearly the answer, or the questions that need to be asked, are such things as, can there be an architecture without profile? And if so, what would it begin to be? Now, what Moretti argues is that the essential notion of the modernist movement was to attempt to deny profile, but clearly in denying profile, it produced another as equally devastating notion of profile. The second idea that one wanted to deal with in the second project was this question of Poche. Poche, again, devolves from the notion of figure and therefore profile and therefore outline. And Poche is something that is, in a way, articulated through cutting away, that is, cutting form out of solid, leaving the residue between the profile and the void was the Poche. And Poche in classical architecture was always dealing with the container, always dealing with present and solid, and again, with the same conditions that have pertained as thought to be natural in Western architecture. Now again, Poche was one of those discourses that was thrown out by modernist architecture and brought back in again in this rather decorative way because it no longer had any value in real structure by the postmodernists. So what I thought would be interesting to do would be to investigate both profile and Poche. And last fall, I did a studio at Harvard simultaneously with the design of the projects that I'm going to show you, which dealt with the work of Sebastiano Serlio. And everybody said, why are we looking at Serlio? Well, I said, because I am convinced that if we're going to deal with complexity in architecture, we cannot deal with bugs jumping around on the screen, because in order to do something with it, we're going to have to freeze the bugs. You know, they have to stop, and then we're just going to be pattern making, you know, and someone's going to say, wow, look at those shapes, you know, as the scientists do, you know, they like the patterns. You know, to freeze the bugs and then build a model of frozen bugs is certainly not complexity. It may be complication, but it's certainly not what the scientists have in mind, and certainly what I think architecture should be about. So what I did was to find the most, what I would call, anarchic architect, Sebastiano Serlio, who, according to Howard Burns, the ultimate authority on Renaissance architecture, who used to teach at this illustrious institution, he said Serlio's not even an architect. Now, why isn't Serlio an architect? Because he does not fall within the conventional strictures of architecture, perhaps because he only built 1 or 2 buildings, but more because he was a subversive person and did not conform to the rules that most architectural historians make up for categorizing what is an architecture or what is, not architecture. So we set out to prove Howard Burns wrong. One, that Serlio was an architect, and in fact he was an architect who dealt with this very notion of subversion, that he took on the problem of type form and conventional form as he understood it through the question of profile and Poche, and produced for his time a radically different idea of Poche and profile, which was to lead to the works of Palladio, of Vignola, Scamozzi, and eventually to Borromini and Bernini. That this change occurred, I think you can pinpoint it just about shortly after Bramante. And it's when Serlio was working with Peruzzi and Giulio Romano that there is this sudden break. Never really analyzed by architectural historians because they do not understand things as subversive categories. And what we did was to do an exhaustive analysis, again on computer modeling, and I don't have the tools to show you the results of some of these things, but they're very interesting. They're like little bugs moving around. We had Serlio moving on very advanced computer modelings to show really what happened with the development of Poche and profile in his work. Very simply put, the question of Poche and profile has always been used to define periods of architecture. For example, in Voeuflin's book, The Renaissance and the Baroque, what Voeuflin says is that the profile in the Renaissance was articulate, the profile in the Baroque was blurred. Now, what we're talking about here is not merely the blurring of profile or the articulating of profile, but to find this other condition which lies buried, I say, the question of its presentness, which lies buried between this iconic and typological notion of articulate or blurred, which is a combination of iconic and instrumental. And what we attempted to do with Serlio was to open up these kinds of reductive categories to find other possible alternatives. Now, at the same time that I was doing this, we were working on 2 projects in the office. I don't want to say that these projects represent any kind of answers to the question, but they are further questions. And I want to show you a few slides from them today. They merely ask the questions, is there some other way of dealing with the possibility of volumetric organization other than solid massing? Can we approximate through some analogous means a way of making void and solid massing that interact with each other, and to produce other conditions of both profile and solid. Can we start with the slides, please? Should start with 47. Yeah, there you go.
Control the slides from up here.
Yeah, I'll control them. No, if I knew how. There's another slide, I think. Okay, I'll tell her. Is there a pointer? No.
I'll get it later. Hubert has laser.
Okay. This is a project that we were commissioned to do for the German painter Georg Imendorf in Dusseldorf. And it was a site very much like the Rietveld site in Utrecht, which was at the end of a row of warehouses. We were given a very nice site. And Imendorf essentially said he wanted some functions. He wanted a club and a restaurant and some artist studios. But basically, he wanted to find a way to bring art and architecture together. And so there were really no programmatic restrictions. And the city of Dusseldorf, interestingly enough, said to us that whatever we wanted to do, they would reinvent the zoning for it, which is an unheard of notion. In any case, we started to work with these kinds of diagrams on very dumb computers. We were modeling these interacting waves that we found with the idea of the soliton, which is this disturbance in water in a liquid state, which eventually in some cases turns into tidal waves. But what was interesting for us, they were the interaction of these two waves, waveforms, were what was made interesting, because what we were trying to do was find a way to use these two interacting waves as analogous solid and voids. Rather than the solid being dominant and the void being secondary, we wanted to see two conditions of almost equal energy. Next two, please. And we took these wave forms and we brought them up in diagrams through a section, only restrained on one side because we had a wall on one side to restrain the growth of this thing. And we let the thing mutate, as it were, these two things moving through one another. And you can see one of the waves forms the outside surface and the other wave forms an inside surface, and you can see it growing up in this conic shape here, coming through the top of the structure there. This essentially gave us the, in a sense, two shells, both an interior and an exterior shell, with, as it were, profiles that were twisting through each other as they moved up in section. Next two, please. You can see some very primitive model. This is the site, and there you can see it in site plan, and there's a small model of, the only way we could make this thing was in horizontal layers because we couldn't model it. There were double curves in it that what we had made on the computer we couldn't make in a physical model. So there is the first sort of primitive model we made of this thing. Next, please. There is the exterior surface, the computer drawing, and again, what it might look like. We had to break these surfaces down because in order to be able to build this in an economic situation, we had to turn each of the panes of glass from double curve to a single surface of the same size. The only way that the developer would look at this is if we could guarantee that each piece of glass would be the same. So here we produced a rendering of this object where these things, and you can see this inside piece that twists through here on the outside, yet all pieces of glass are the same size. Again, one of the restrictions that you get when you're dealing with the construction industry. Next, please. Two views of it computer. Next. These two models are very interesting. This is we made this model of horizontal layers of glass, and we were able to construct, as it were, by cutting the glass out inside, these this inside layer, as it were, that came through the outside layer. And it gave very much the effect that we wanted to have of these two oscillating layers that twist through one another. Here is a very much more conventional view of this object, with the outer layer stripped away with its structure, and then the inner layer. Now, the inner layer is the layer that we decided that we would have 6 German painters paint vertically on, so that what you would see, instead of having, one floor and have these horizontal painting, you would now have 6 vertical slots of artists, including Markus Lupertz, Gerd Richter, Baselitz, Imendorf, all of this group of German painters. They are now, what's interesting is when you get all of these big egos into one room. Imendorf loved this project, but then we got all the egos together and they said they thought the architecture was too strong, it was too good, and it didn't make enough allowance for their painting. And they said, what we really want is a dumb box with our paintings being exhibited. And of course, what's so interesting about painters is that's what they all want. They want everything, even though they are critical of the social domain in which they work. The one domain that they don't want to be activated is the architectural domain. That is the wall on which they make their work. They're very interested in having their work be savage, as it were, and not naturalized by the wall. So painters intuitively realizes that architects are their sworn enemies. And the minute you try and, in a sense, make the wall savage, as I tried to do in the model on the right, the painters got very, very upset. So we're now struggling with the savage wall versus the savage canvas, and we'll see what happens. What is so interesting is the city of Dusseldorf supports me. Whether that means the banks of Dusseldorf support me or not is another issue. And that's what counts, whether you get it built or not. Next, please. These were sections. Next. You can see that gray piece is the inside shell moving through and twisting out through the exterior shell. Next, please. And there you can see one of the plans and the diagrams of how this thing, this interior piece, twists up and grows, as you can see it grow and almost take over the outside piece at this point, and then there is this funny little piece growing up again as another kind of outside piece coming from the inside, which again grows and breaks through the top surface. So there is this organic evolution of this piece as it moves through its from bottom to top. Next, please. Next. Now this is a competition that we did for the city of Tours. It was an art center. What's interesting about this competition is that the competitors were Daniel Libeskind, Coop Himmelblau, Morphosis, myself, etc. In other words, what one might call edge group architects. But the jury was the most conservative jury that you could find. And what's so interesting, it's, again, ants, bugs to grass, I think. When the bugs saw that there was grass, that is a commission to build, it's very interesting how the bugs quickly left their natural state of being on the outside and immediately did very conservative projects. Our project remained, to this very conservative jury, radical. Now, what's so interesting, because I believe that the building of architecture is a political act very different from drawings or models. Because this jury voted our project last. This is the project that they hated the most of all the projects. But it was our project, and particularly the model of our project that I'm going to show you, that they wanted to exhibit. This was the project that was to be exhibited as emblematic of the avant-garde nature of this competition, right? And we've been fighting for the last 3 months because I have refused to allow them to exhibit the model, since we were not good enough to be voted to build the building. I said we were not good enough to be exhibited. But they felt that the model should be exhibited, and I felt this is a very interesting thing, that they have no problem with models because these are tame creatures. They only become subversive in building. And I think that's what's interesting, that the fear on the part of the community was that this thing could be built, but as a model, it had lost its savage quality. And again, there's this difference between the model which sits within the space and the space itself created by the model. That somehow there is this subversive and savage nature to an affective space which is contained in the notion of the model. In any case, that's only a final sort of peripheral result. What we started to do here was we wanted to make a building without an initial profile, that is, without a shape. And we also wanted to investigate the notion of void poche. How could we make a poche that was void? And in a sense, it's like working with these experiments that the scientists have shown us between pieces of glass to see what happens to the slime mold and the bugs, etc., and the ants, because we had 2 pieces of glass. We had an 18th century building here in gray, and we had a 19th century building here that we had to build between. In other words, we had to produce our object in this space here. Basically, what the people wanted was a little square here, and a little round guy here, or a little round guy there, and a square there, and everything would have been fine. They would have had a courtyard in the middle, and basically that's what they wanted. But what they really didn't want was to fill up their courtyard, with the sense of producing something in between. And what we did was take these 2 exterior pieces of glass that were given and use those as, in a sense, as the generative points. And what we did was to run a very primitive morphing program, taking the profiles of this building and this building here and let them run through each other in various stages of movement to produce, in a sense, a formless or shapeless object itself that took its cues from the forms out here. In other words, this is the filling, as it were, the peanut butter in the sandwich of these 2 18th and 19th century buildings. We thought this was a very contextual approach. We thought they would really, in fact, love it. Of course, we knew they were going to hate it. And here you can see the actual models, the layered models of the morphing diagrams that we actually built to see the effect of different weightings of the section or weightings of the plan in this project. Next, please. Sorry I have such bad slides. Of course, we produced what you would call plans, but clearly they didn't read them as plans because they had never seen plans that looked like this, which did not, in a sense, have a kind of profile, a recognizable profile. And these brown areas here were pieces of the profile, let's say, that were eroded or eroding, as it were, the solid from inside. In other words, the void was seen to be eroding the solid from the inside. Next 2, please. I want to take you through a series of the models that we made. This was the first stage of this work. It has no section. It's merely an extrusion in plan. And again, what you notice is that the voids are starting to eat away from the inside to produce characteristic elements. That we produce the characteristic elements not by starting with a profile, but eating away to find profile within the solid. Next two, please. And again, you know, one can't say, is this characteristic of one's work? It's not characteristic of anything because it's trying to move away from the kinds of characteristics, let's say, that articulate work of, you know, at any one time of one's work. Here is the second model, and this now begins to have the morphing of these tower elements here and over here. These pavilion elements and the tower elements were morphed again through one another, again in a very primitive way to start to produce some kind of roof and sectional deformation. Next, please. And it gets further articulated as a secondary system begins to eat away from the interior of this. Here we felt that it got too eaten away, too many of these things. We let it go to a certain point where it started to not leave any functional space nor anything that one could recognize as the void eating away the solid. It became too then ribbon-like, and we began to get profile again. So what happened is we had taken the system, in a sense, too far and produced a new kind of profile, or another kind of profile. Next, please. So we backed off that into something like this. And again, you have to understand this borders on a level of what one might call expressionism, but only in the sense is that nobody drew any of these forms. Nobody had a preconceived idea what this object was going to look like. It was never drawn by anybody. It was only modeled on the computer, and then we took certain stages of that and built these three-dimensional models. And we didn't correct it aesthetically or functionally. We kept allowing this computer to take certain different kinds of inputs from the glass, as it were, surrounding objects. Next, please. There is the, as it were, where we were when we finished with this, what I would call excretion, really. It's, you know, seems to be oozing out from between these two plates, which was the characteristic that we wanted it to have, to, in a sense, have this sense of ooze. This is what Herbert Muschamp in the New York Times called swamp mold, and a new term which I'm certain is going to send a lot of people scurrying to find out what swamp mold is. But this is what he had seen, and assumed that he misheard slime mold for swamp mold. Next, please. So much for the New York Times fact checkers.
Had you said slime?
I had said slime. I never heard of swamp mold.
Yep.
Can we have the lights, please? We have lights. I want to conclude what I have to say with a caveat about what you're looking at and what is being discussed here. I am very worried as I go through schools of architecture in the United States with the advancement of theory which has really grown in importance and in estimation throughout the United States, there is a corresponding lack of capacity for students to be able to be involved with skills, to be able to do anything with the theory. And there is coming a violent right-wing, I say, or conservative backlash, which I think problematizes the whole effort of theory as it has been developed in the last 20 years. It's because we who have been involved in theory have not looked after discipline, discourse, knowledge as well. In other words, we have assumed that a student armed with theory is going to be all right. Now, having taught design studio for 25 or 30 or 40 years, which is no necessary correlation to anything, I have always known that there is no correlation between arming a student with a good theory and the design work that he or she would produce. That is, good students always produce good designs, bad students produce bad designs, whether they are armed with good or bad theory. Why I went back to teaching Serlio at Harvard was precisely because I thought that it might provide an intersection between theory and discipline, theory and skill, and theory and knowledge. Because what was interesting to me on the first day, I asked each of the 15 students who Sebastiano Serlio was. They had no idea. Now, clearly, not only did they not have any idea, but they probably thought it was irrelevant or unnecessary to have any idea as to who he was. I followed that quickly with 10 other munchkins from the same period, Bramante, Peruzzi, Vignola, Sangallo, Scamozzi, etc., and I asked them for a building by each. One student managed to score 20%. These are Harvard students. All of the rest were between 10 and 0. In other words, there was absolutely no knowledge of any of this stuff. I then asked them to give me 10 buildings by Le Corbusier. And after Villa Garche and some other things, strange named things, there was also this right? You realize it was just not from incunabula and arcania that these students were suffering from. There was a kind of general lack of any notion that the history of the discipline was important either to the future of the discipline or to the speculation about the discipline. That these people were quite prepared to take issues of complexity, questions of profile, and go willy-nilly into explorations of profile and Poche without even being able to know where they were going to find exemplars. In other words, it didn't matter because they were all working with computers. They could call this stuff up on the computer and make it themselves, right? Now, I am absolutely put in a state of trauma by this kind of student behavior. And of course, it may be my advancing years, it may be my latent conservatism, any number of those things. But I don't believe that it's possible to engorge the 2 days of talk that you are hearing from scientists and science enviers, and in fact do anything with it unless you begin from square one in architecture. And unless you have square one in architecture, I am not convinced that any of this can mean anything. I'm also convinced that precisely because I have had one of the most extraordinary educations in architecture, that at least I can stand here in front of you and tell you that I think the only reason that I can be here is precisely because of this discipline that I have had. And that I really believe that to start scratching around with bugs and ants and mutating, displacing, emerging, aggregating, niggle-noggle. If you don't have any kind of discipline in architecture, is going to leave you where I see a lot of students in a lot of juries unable to perform. Thank you.
Should I get your cane, or can you stand over there? Any questions for
Charles has a question.
Charles? Go ahead.
He wants to-
Go ahead. You can go first.
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to go back to your issue about modeling void. I mean, what about the discourse of space in modernism, from Schmazoff to Mies, and the whole idea that the theme, the essential theme of architecture was the modeling of space, not the modeling of form, and certainly, and those commentators were even placed in the kind of Hegelian triad that there was the architecture of exterior and antiquity, the architecture of interior in the Middle Ages, and the specificity of modernity was to do with the interaction of the two in a new conception of space, especially in cubism, or cubean and not cubean.
I would probably disagree with the notion that modernism modeled void. Certainly Mies, for me, did not. Mies saw space as what I would call zero. And there was no pressure on any of Mies's surface from voids as you find in Le Corbusier. There's no tension on the surface of the glass in the Farnsworth House, in the Berlin Museum, in the Tugendhat House, as you find on the surface of Poissy, Garches, etc. So there's clearly a difference in the spatial notion, for me, of Corbu and Mies. I would say that Corbu is one of the few people that dealt with the modeling of void. And certainly Ronchamp is one of the most important examples of that notion of the void pressing on the solid. The void in Mies never presses, to me, on the solid, never engages the surface in any way at all. It remains mute. These two things do not ever interact in the surface. I spent 3 years at Cambridge writing a thesis on this very subject of the notion of void modeling, and tried with Alto, with Frank Lloyd Wright, with Mies, Tarani, Le Corbusier, many of the modernist period, to try and find a notion of void modeling. What I'm talking about is not the same as the modeling of space in either cubism or in De Stijl or in constructivism. Clearly constructivism was modeling solids and the intersection and interacting of solids, as I believe De Stijl was. Cubism is the only place where you have this collapse of the frontal plane and the side planes into some sort of shallow space, into some sort of compressed space on a vertical surface, which is not the attitude of Mies to space. And this collapse of space in the cubist sense is one of the few places in modernist space where you have, in a sense, a modeling of void. You certainly have a modeling of void in the work of, let's say, Borromini, where clearly the void in many of his spaces, in fact, press against solids. What I'm trying to do is to suggest that what I was trying to find is another attitude toward the modeling of space that did not begin from the exterior, in other words, require an attitude of the compression of the exterior surface to recognize the void. In other words, in the case of Borromini and in the case of Le Corbusier, the way you understand the void is by its pressure on the profile. And what I wanted to do was to find a way of facing this problem without having, that's why I asked the question last night of Professor Goodwin about the fact that he was so interested in the pressure on the surface, but not the behavior of the pressure. What I'm interested in is not the resultant behavior of the surface, but the behavior of the pressure, as it were, in the uncontained condition.
So please, very
Wait.
in the wall.
I didn't say he wasn't interested in the wall. I didn't say,
Charles?
no, that's not the question you asked. I know Mises interested in the wall. I was saying is he was not interested in the relationship of that pressure of the space to the wall. They sat, in a sense, apart from each other. The wall, there was never any compression at the wall of the space. You never felt any energy, any tensile energy, let's say you feel at the surface, let's say, of a Jasper Johns canvas, or of a, when you have these flags and targets, you have this notion of a stress at the edge of the canvas, which defines a certain level of modernist space. Mies was never interested in that condition of stress. I mean, that's it.
One would ask, I won't, but one
Yeah.
would ask whether tensile definition of the void versus delimited definition, which is what Mies, in fact, if you go Ulrich Lange, Tugendhat, Barcelona Pavilion, all the way up to National Gallery, what you find is exactly an effort to model space without tensile organizations. In fact, it's delimiting through
Yeah, it's
planes.
not. It's absolutely, there is no tensile or compressive.
Okay. I wouldn't ask that, though, but
Yeah.
one would ask that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you really look at it, it's closer, Peter. You can find people like Kiesler and Moretti himself and Mendelssohn, a whole lot of people. I think
Moretti
I think-
for sure.
Yeah, Moretti for sure. They're both-
Oh, Moretti for sure.
But I think that there's a certain truth in what that question was saying, and I mean, surely the modern movement thought it was doing that. But I think the important thing there is that your notion of void is different from space anyway. It's to do with
That's-
formlessness.
that's
And
right.
So, in a way, it's a different. Well, it's importantly different.
I was trying to make that
And
difference.
Yeah,
I don't.
yeah, I mean, you made the point. So in a way, you can. But I still think there's another tradition of modernism coming out of Gaudi and going to Kiesler. Okay.
Whoa.
It's like canonic.
No, wait a minute. Let's say, we have to be careful, Charles, when you and I start talking, when you say, could you
No,
look
let's
at it?
not, 'cause
Let's not get into this
let's not get
closer.
into
Should we look at it closer? There's always that, oh my God, Peter, you don't look at things close enough. And of course, I always say, Charles, you don't see, and then we are into this terrible problem. I think that you've hit the point precisely that I was trying to express a condition of formlessness which deals with the surface in a very different way than any membrane of whether it's Kiesler, Mendelssohn, etc. It's a different attitude toward the membrane.
What I
Go
wanted to
ahead.
ask was this question of the subversive and the savage, and if we put the Pollock back on the floor, would it be savage again, and why isn't Rorschach savage? And your incredible oscillation, which is really a contradiction at the end of the day, on this question of function and aesthetics, and you berate us, and you berate architects for not being able to be straightforward about aesthetics, and then you say almost as a boast. I can remember the design of Park Hill, Sheffield, when they boasted they hadn't designed the facades. Remember, they said a computer did it.
Yeah.
We aren't responsible, and how manly that was. So, Peter, you're oscillating here like mad because you say on the one hand, I put down this extrusion, and you boast about it being an oozing excretion, and you use all these things, and I liked it. I mean, your words, if you listen to your words, you were saying, which is full of aesthetic.
Mm-hmm.
I like it, therefore I'm doing it this way. And you said, and you give it, and then you say, on the other hand, you say, well, I didn't make any aesthetic choices, and I'm against aesthetic choices. So, which is it, Hamlet? Are you saying I like aesthetic choices when I like them, and I don't when I don't, or what? How do you generally?
I would be as open as I can. I'm writing a little, it's in response to Herbert Muschamp's piece, a little piece for my own consumption. I believe that I'm one of the most controlling architects that could be. I differentiate power, I want to differentiate power and control. While I'm perceived to have power, I think I have very little power. Power is something which manifests itself in a certain kind of social behavior, in a kind of over situations which are outside of the individual. I'm very much more interested in control of my own individual being, and I work very hard at that. And I would argue that everything I do has to do with control and not interest at all in power, which is another form of power because it gets people anxious, because people cannot, in a sense, utilize power over my condition of being. I fall outside of this. So therefore, what I do, whether I say I'm for aesthetics or not for aesthetics, or for, it's all within a matrix of enormous control. Right? And it is the will, the free will, I would argue, that I have to exercise control as I wish it to be within my domain. How it affects others is another issue. But I would argue that when the machine, I would say, when that object in Tour, I knew when it looked bad right as opposed to bad wrong, okay? And now you could say to me, Peter, could you quite analyze what bad right and bad wrong was? And I tried to today and say bad wrong was when it got to be too vertebrate, too linear, too much frame-like, all right? And that's not what the intention of the exercise was. And that's all I can say. The intention was to look bad, but not look frame-like, linear, vertebrate, or any of those kinds of things.
Bad wrong is tough. I think the Museum of Modern Art is full of bad right now. But
That's great.
thanks.
That's very good.
Also, a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds, and no one's ever thought that Peter had a small mind, and so consistency has never been one of the strengths of Peter's argument, I don't think.
I would have hoped today that we don't get deflected into saying, where are you? I mean, what I'm interested in is your reaction, gut reaction, to the Imendorf project and the Tour project, you know, as possible invocations of looking at conventions of architecture in another, within another framework. That's purely all I was trying to do with those. They're initial primitive gestures. You know, they're not very sophisticated. So,
Yeah. Oh, back here. Sorry, we ignore this.
What were the criteria on which the artists were selected?
How would the...
well, first of all, I didn't select them. Number one, they were selected by Imendorf, who I have no idea. They're his friends, I guess. They hang around together. They dress the same. They look the same. I mean, they all wear black with lots of rings on their fingers and have shaved heads and, you know, a kind of standard painter's uniform, I guess.
Thank you. The soliton.
Only because we were trying to find something that had a binary condition of more or less not a dominant, one was dominant, one was secondary. That was purely, you know, accident, let's say.
Nothing to do with the way they looked.
Nothing to do with the way that I had never seen the way they looked. I only had read about them, that they had this binary thing. I had no idea the way they looked.
Foolish honesty is also...
My question is slightly related to that. What point do you think this typological influence gets added onto the chosen way forward?
I think that all of us are cognizant when we begin that we are making enclosure, habitable enclosure of some sort, that we have a responsibility. We can't make, I mean, suppose these soliton waves produce spaces that were so thin that humans couldn't get in them, right? And we had series of layers of Swiss cheese. I mean, clearly that wouldn't have worked. So we always have an operable model of what may be a functioning type that allows the space to be. Clearly, from the point of view of a functioning office, the spaces that we've produced are not what you would call optimal. And clearly, only a unique bunch of crazies would allow someone to produce spaces like this. In other words, if, for example, a developer came along and said we need to rent this as marketable office space, I would be out. as Zaha is out in Dusseldorf because a developer came along and took these spaces that she made and said, we can't rent them. The same thing could happen to me. So at a certain point, you have some limit as to what human existence can be like under certain conditions within these spaces as a priori to the investigation.
Any questions?
You said that Poche was that which was between profile and void. But isn't it actually that Poche is that which is captured between either a continuous profile or a series of profiles and doesn't actually interface with the void?
Well, there are two ways of looking at it, Don. I mean, I think this is an interesting question. Whether Poche is continuously wrapped by a profile which then has no engagement with the void, rather, or whether or Poche is in fact impinged upon by void. I would argue I was taking a Searlean view, because if you look at the difference between Serlio's profile, not more closely, but just look at the difference between Serlio's profile and, say, Palladio's profile or Giulio Romano's profile. In Giulio Romano and Palladio, there is a certain neutrality vis-a-vis the void and the profile. They sort of sit like the Mesian space. But in Serlio, there is a pressure that is exerted by the interior space which hits into the Poche. You really feel that disturbance in the Poche from the space itself. And that's why, for me, Serlio's Poche is a very interesting one, because it does begin to involve the internal space in a way which, say, Giulio Romano and Palladio do not. The Poche is very much more neutral in those cases, not acted upon.
Will you permit me one question?
Sure.
I'd like to take issue with your last remarks about the relationship between theory and history and the necessity for a thoroughgoing knowledge of the canonic history of the discipline of architecture.
I said that purposely for you, as you know.
I would say you said that purposely against me, but I think...
But for and against with you and I are always interchangeable.
I think everyone in this room would agree that respect for discipline means knowledge of the discipline and its history. But I also think that the idea that there's a canonic history independent of any theoretical formulation, and that all theoretical formulations require a common knowledge of a canonic history, is a fundamental mistake. In fact, it's ideology and theory that produces the terms and conditions of a canonic history. I believe all of your students knew a history, could have named 10 Eisenman buildings, could have named 10 Mies buildings, could have possibly named 10 Gehry buildings, could, even if we needed to go into earlier, if you needed to be in earlier times, might have been able to name 10 members of the expressionist group. So your question was impossible for them to answer, because your question has to do with your own ideological and theoretical prejudices about what stands as a canonic history.
There's no question, Jeff, that the latter part of what you said is true, that all history is made up of ideological strictures, let's say, as to what it constitutes canon and what doesn't, all right? Just pick up a history book of architecture, pick up Banham or pick up Gideon, and you think you're reading two different histories, correct? So clearly history is a formulation of a certain kind of ideology. What I'm suggesting is that these students seem to be without any ideological stricture whatsoever. In other words, I couldn't locate them. The reason why I started with the Renaissance, then I jumped to Le Corbusier, because I thought I was jumping ideological strictures to find some mechanism by which to locate how we could deal with the question of Poche and profile. I found little evidence of any. And what worries me is that in situations like this, when theory becomes such a dominant discourse as to erode the discipline, I find that students are less and less able to perform. Now this is purely no experiment or just an observation that I wanted to, yeah.
Well, in a way, I'd like to make the point that you both seem to assume that there's a difference between you. whereas in fact
There's a
it's not.
profound difference between us.
In the sense that the question is not whether the canon relates to the present or the past, but in your terms, you said at the beginning, what you gave is a non-canonical definition of a canon. That is, it's normally thought to be a historically based kind of series of authoritative instances. Linked to your idea of like presentness,
Yeah.
the canon is the reverse. It's that which is present by continuing to kind of subvert. And therefore, in a sense, does not, except chronologically, belong to the past. So that there isn't a question of the question is not initially kind of history or not.
No.
It's a question of what it is to be present through a certain subversion. And the series gets constructed on that basis.
But that would also include, and let me remark on the collaboration between two of the scientific speakers in Nietzsche, the absolute necessity for forgetting, the absolute necessity to not remember parts of the history as part of a theoretical necessity.
But as you know, in my algorithm, forgetting is part of my name.
No private conversations. Any other discussions from the back? I see a hand and no body attached. Very interesting. Short, Mark. That's okay, but this length.
I liked your lecture a lot.
Thank you.
I have a problem which I don't think is great. You.
Could you speak up?
Am I not speaking loudly?
No.
Okay. It really concerns the notion of canon, of erecting a canon. And this, I think your characterization of kind of autonomous practice is something that comes out at the beginning of the lecture, and I'd like you to expand on it. When you talk about Rosalind Krauss's instancing of Jackson Pollock, for example, the transformation when something leaves the floor and kind of moves onto the wall, this doesn't seem to be merely a physical action, as certainly defined by Krauss. It's a kind of a cultural action, a form of agreement which produces meaning. And within that, architecture is a constituent of that meaning. It's a part of it. It isn't autonomous from it. And what you seem to say from the very beginning is declaring a kind of autonomy for our practice, or for architectural practice. And it's interesting how you use Pollock, and interesting in the Düsseldorf project, the paintings that you relate to are actually part of an advocacy of art practice which is in fact autonomous. So Imendorf, the expressionist, if I may continue, Imendorf, the expressionist, Greenbergian definition of Jackson Pollock and so on. But it seems to me what you come into real difficulties when your autonomy crashes into somebody else's autonomy. Let's say when your autonomy in the Düsseldorf project crashes into the supposed coherence of those people's practices. And one of the things that the other scientist said, Mr. Allen, Dr. Allen yesterday, he was talking about contingency and about the meaning that is produced by the kind of the coexistence of things, really, the accidents and so on, ideas of error. They seem to be part of your practice, but you don't really seem to acknowledge them. And I wondered if you could say something about it.
Well, let me say, I think what I was trying to say in the Krauss example was that architecture, precisely because there were these cultural meanings associated, not just the physical lifting and putting, but the whole cultural meaning that implied by the painting on the wall, was a thought to be natural condition of architecture, that the relationship between the meaning of the wall and its instrumentality, what it did, were so linked that nobody thought that you could break these apart. My autonomy, as it were, my work, has always been about, and I articulate it now in a way I think more clearly, the attempt to subvert this thought to be natural condition, saying that it, A, is not natural, and that an equally natural tendency of architecture is in fact the possibility and indeed the necessity to constantly subvert
this cultural strata that occupies physical form in architecture. And that's all I tried to do, was to show attempts in which I was trying to break these things apart. Clearly, the attempt to break it apart in terms of the painters was running into their idea of what the autonomy of painting was within a cultural practice. Clearly, you're right. That's absolutely what has happened. But that doesn't invalidate my search for me in any way.
Okay, thank you.
Wait, let me...
Sorry.
That's okay,
I
but
wouldn't want to invalidate your search, but I think within that search there's a really problematic area. I mean, when you talk about profile, for example, and about the historical examples, you're immediately not just talking about profile, but you're talking about the problem of representation, which itself tears asunder the possibility of any kind of coherence, because of its lack, its loss. And I think that's a problem to think about.
okay, we're doing okay on time, but we're running just a little bit behind. I'm going to introduce the last speaker of the morning session. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.